11, 12, 13.
Hello, and welcome to the Top 5 Cannabis Industry Challenges. My name is Kathy Bennett-Warner, Director of Public Relations from Steep Hill. Steep Hill is the global leader in cannabis testing and analytics. I will be your moderator for today. Joining me are our panelists, Amanda Borup, Policy Analyst of the Recreational Marijuana Program from the Oregon Control Commission, and Sunny Jones, Cannabis Policy Coordinator of the Oregon Department of Agriculture. Today's webinar is an example of the information you'll hear at InfoCast's upcoming event, the second Cannabis Compliance Summit on July 19th to 21st in Los Angeles, California. Join us at the only meeting that unites regulators, testing labs, service providers, and operators. Make sure to register at infocast.com/cannabis before June 2nd to save up to $300. For our webinar today, please note that you are able to submit questions via your chat panel on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We will make sure to answer questions if time permits. Thank you. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists, Amanda and Sunny. It's very nice to meet you today. Can you give our audience a bit about your background and how you came to your current position? Amanda, could you start for us, please?
Yes, thank you. My name is Amanda Borup, and I'm a policy analyst with the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. The Oregon Liquor Control Commission regulates the recreational marijuana program in Oregon. Before joining the OLCC, I worked for various state agencies, and most recently I worked on the medical marijuana implementation for the state of Illinois. I think one of the things I enjoy most about my current position is the variety of the topics that we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Great. And Sunny, can you answer the same question? Give us a little of your background.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Sunny. I'm with the Oregon Department of Agriculture, as you said. I'm the Cannabis Policy Coordinator. My background is in pesticides. I worked for a couple of years for the National Pesticide Information Center at Oregon State University. And then after that, I have been with the department's pesticide program for about 10 years, both in outreach and education and in enforcement. And then when Measure 91 passed in Oregon and we legalized recreational cannabis or recreational marijuana, the department realized that while we don't directly regulate the marijuana growers, there's a lot of opportunities for outreach and connection both to the industry and to our partner agencies. So I've been in this position for a little over a year and a half.
Great. Very interesting. And thank you both for your participation today. This webinar will cover the top 5 cannabis industry challenges from the perspective of Amanda and Sunny, who face these challenges in Oregon every day in their work. We know that each state has a different perspective and that all states facing regulatory challenges are working together to solve problems for their own state. But there's still lots to learn from each other, and Oregon has set a very high standard. And we know that other states are watching both Amanda and Sunny's work in the state. So let's jump right into the challenges. Okay, challenge number 1, finding a regulatory balance between too little testing and too much testing. Let's get the Oregon perspective here. Amanda, what kind of cannabis testing does Oregon require?
So as far as the testing requirements for the state of Oregon, the agency called the Oregon Health Authority actually writes the testing requirements for both the medical and the recreational marijuana programs. And so all products in both programs are tested prior to the final sale to the consumer or prior to being transferred to a patient. So a couple of examples of this would be usable marijuana. So if it's a flower marijuana item and it's being sold directly to a retail outlet or a dispensary, it would be tested for pesticides and water content and potency prior to that transfer. And then if it was something like an extract, which would be maybe an oil in a vape pen, it would be tested for pesticides, solvents, and potency. So depending on the product and where it's at in the chain, in the supply chain, it could be tested for a variety of things depending on its final use. And I'd also like to point out that the Oregon Health Authority has a really great website that talks about our testing requirements in a really easy to read fashion. And so people that wanted to know more about our actual requirements could look there.
Great. Okay. And how do regulations help the industry achieve an FDA, USDA-like standard?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so one of the things that we've done in Oregon is that all of our testing laboratories are required to be accredited by an agency called ORLAP. And ORLAP is actually the Oregon Environmental Regulatory Accreditation Program, and they regulate or accredit other laboratories in the state. ORLAP falls under the Oregon Health Authority, and the goals of having the labs accredited is that it's going to streamline the methodologies that are used in the testing and be able to give testing results throughout the state that are similar. So you could have something tested, let's say, in the Portland metro area, and you would get a similar result as if you did somewhere in Southern Oregon, making it a fair playing field for the industry.
That's
Another thing I'd like to point out, which is aside from testing, is actually we have pretty strong labeling requirements. And so the industry at the point of final sale is required to have labels on their products so that the consumers are also aware of what kind of products that they're getting.
Great. Okay. In your view, Amanda, what is the right balance between ensuring a safe and clean cannabis supply and not making testing too expensive for the marketplace?
So I think this is probably one of the larger issues that the health authority deals with when they're writing the testing requirements. The health authority works with the Liquor Control Commission and then also with the Department of Agriculture on a regular basis. But since they have the actual authority, they are the agency that writes the rules. They have to keep in mind, public health and safety, but then also, what the industry is able to test to, and then the cost of testing on the other licensees. And so one of the things that I think all of the agencies really try to keep in mind is the fact that by Oregonians passing ballot measure 91, which legalized marijuana, it's part of our job as agencies to make sure that products can move through the supply chain and actually end up in the marketplace. And so we really have to look at, it's like an ongoing assessment and modification of the requirements, just depending on, the research available, what the industry can have tested. And the nice thing about Oregon is that the industry has been very positive about the testing because it really gives them a way to show consumers that they're providing a clean product.
Okay. Okay, challenge number 2, lack of research in the industry. We all know that cannabis does not have access to traditional research studies badly needed for the medical and wellness community to establish agreed to standards due to its Schedule I status. How do you as regulators deal with this lack of research? Where do you go for your information and data?
So what we do in Oregon is we really rely on our other state agencies and their expertise. When we're trying to make rules or regulations based on a certain area, we'll reach out to other state agencies that already have expertise in that area with other industries. Also work a lot with other states that have legalized cannabis. And then being willing to make necessary adjustments when research and data become available. I think something good to point out here is that the Oregon legislature realized that there was this lack of research around cannabis, and they actually made a certain license type. It's actually called a research certificate, and the OLCC is able to look at people's research proposals in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture and the Health Authority and be able to grant those research certificates. And those research certificates are supposed to benefit the Oregon cannabis industry, medical research, or public health and safety.
Okay. How can industry and regulators better share information? I'm addressing this question to both Amanda and Sunny. how can you interact with each other to greater understand newly emerging science, data, and desired outcomes?
So what we did at the Oregon Liquor Control Commission initially, and the Health Authority and Department of Agriculture have done very similar things, is we've had a very extensive public process around our regulations and rulemaking. We were able to bring in industry, citizens, other state agencies, and be able to talk through the issues around legalization and around regulation to be able to have that open conversation. It's really showed that we're able to build relationships that way, and that it makes the flow of information a lot easier. People know that if they have ideas or concepts, they have research or data available, they can share that with agencies, and we're able to look at it and be able to share information that way.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, you're talking, Kathy, here about like medical and wellness research, but that's not the only research that is lacking in the cannabis industry. And you notice I use cannabis because in Oregon we also have industrial hemp. So ODA directly regulates industrial hemp, and it's kind of under that umbrella of cannabis. So we've got industrial hemp and marijuana. So really we're also lacking, you know, ag best practices. What rate of nutrients do I use? What pesticides do I use? And we'll talk about that a little bit here further, I think. But what do I do with water if I'm an indoor grower? And what rate can I put that out on land if I have land that I can apply it to? So that kind of research is lacking. And traditionally, we would look to our state land-grant university and the extension program, which here in Oregon would be Oregon State University. Because it's federally illegal, they are very risk-averse to working with this industry. With the industrial hemp, though, we might have a foot in the door. OSU is starting to work on industrial hemp and some research around that. That research, I think, will be applicable to marijuana as well. So we might be able to work with industry that way. Another would be if the marijuana industry starts, for example, what we call a commodity commission. That's traditionally how ODA works with other agricultural crops, be it grass seed, blueberries, wheat. They have a group that represents that industry, may do research for that industry. So the Commodity Commission, if one was developed for marijuana, could pool their resources and do their own research, working under that research certificate that Amanda described through OLCC. It would give us an opportunity to reach out to the industry a little bit easier in a method that we're used to. But all three of the state agencies, ODA, OLCC, and the Oregon Health Authority, OHA, have very robust listservs. So we send out regular bulletins to the groups. That has been very well received and provides that opportunity for the industry to be kept up to date on a regular basis.
Wow, this lack of research really is a challenge, but it sounds like you guys are addressing it in the best way that you can. Let's go to challenge number 3, the big one, pesticides. Let's talk about the pesticide challenge in the cannabis industry. The news media has been reporting scary stories all over the West Coast. Sunny, what pesticides are approved for use on cannabis in Oregon?
Okay, well, let's take a step back. And like I said, my career background is in pesticides. And one thing I find to be common, even with conventional agriculture, is we don't always have the same definition of what a pesticide is. So I always like to start with that. And then I'm going to give you the geek definition. Pesticide is anything that kills, repels, or mitigates a pest. And then, because it's the government, they like to throw in a little extra tweak. It also includes plant growth regulators, so things like rooting hormones. And all of these are regulated by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So here we, again, run into issues with the feds because everything's regulated at the federal level. And then each state has their own state law that also regulates pesticides. So in Oregon, we have our own Pesticide Control Act. So we're, again, keeping in mind that we're looking at that umbrella term. So pesticide includes insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, disinfectants, and like I said, those plant growth hormones. So in Oregon, if we literally interpreted the law, because everything is registered at the federal level and that determines where a pesticide can be used, i.e. what crop it can be applied to, what rate, etc. If we were to look at the strictest interpretation of the law, we would say that no pesticide could be used on cannabis. That's obviously not a very realistic way to look at it. And so what we've done in Oregon is develop 3 criteria that we feel provide products that would not be illegal for use. And so a product has to meet all 3 criteria. First criteria is that it has to be exempt from the requirement of a tolerance. And basically what that means is when the EPA allows for a chemical to be used on a crop, they establish a residue level or a tolerance that can be on that crop. Some chemicals are low enough in toxicity that the EPA has said they do not require a tolerance. So that's our criteria number 1. The second criteria is the label language has to be really broad, has to allow for some wiggle room. Some labels are broad enough that they basically allow for use on green edible crops. Or in Oregon, we've kind of done the wiggle dance and said cannabis is kind of an herb. So if the label said rosemary, thyme, and basil, we wouldn't allow it. But if it says something like herbs such as, right, these labels are written by lawyers, not to offend any lawyers on the line, but that gives us some wiggle room, right? Labels, herbs such as, and so we could kind of wiggle that cannabis in there. So that's the second criteria. And then the third is if a study has been done to determine what happens to this chemical when you smoke it, i.e. a pyrolysis study, and it did not fail that study, then we would allow that product to be on our guide list. And we publish that guide list on our website. It currently has a little over 300 products on there. And so that's how we've worked through it in Oregon.
Okay. Very challenging. How do you balance concerns with health risks versus product expense?
Yeah, and so, Amanda earlier described that in Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority was tasked with determining what all cannabis would be tested for before it goes to market. And so OHA put together a list of 59, I think it is, active ingredients, so the chemicals in the pesticide that all cannabis has to be tested for. And when they did that, they were looking at the toxicity of the chemical. For example, something like myclobutanil, we're all familiar with as a fungicide. Eagle 20 is one of the trade names for that. That one we happen to know what happens when you burn it, right? It turns into hydrogen cyanide. Kind of something I don't think any of us really want to be breathing in if we're smoking cannabis. So they looked at the relative toxicity and the known data that was available. They also looked at the expense. Pesticides are not an easy lab test, and we're not working with an easy matrix. Cannabis itself has a lot of things that can interfere with running these samples through lab equipment. And the lab equipment itself is quite expensive. So they've tried to take all of that into account, what we know the industry has traditionally used that isn't appropriate. And so they're walking that tightrope, right, of determining we don't have the research. We've talked about that. We don't have that federal oversight that all of the states are traditionally used to working with, but we still need to balance the public health and then keep stuff from going back into the black market, because if we make it too expensive, then folks are going to go buy it from their buddy down the street as opposed to from one of OLC's licensed stores. Right. I don't know if Amanda has anything. Okay, yeah.
Right. This is all very challenging. Okay, so what are you hearing from your colleagues in other states about their concern on the use of pesticides on cannabis, and maybe how you all are talking about pesticides in the regulatory community?
It's obviously, like you said, a challenge, and it's very difficult. When I started in this position, the end of 2015, our then director, Katie Koba, recognized that this was a very challenging issue for our state, again, because we use that framework at the federal level. And so we've started having regular meetings with other states that have recreational cannabis. So we started originally with Colorado and Washington. They have similar guide lists of products that can be used. We've tried to make those lists as consistent among the states as possible. But we're all muddling through as best as we can. We'd like to provide some consistency among the states that do have the legalized cannabis, because there's folks who work in the various states. Somebody works in Colorado and in Oregon. It's nice to have that consistency as much as possible if we can. And we also have started working with the EPA to get their assistance and support where they can. Obviously, their hands are tied a bit, and they're not used to all the wonderful ways that we can use cannabis. They're traditionally looking at people eating a food, not smoking it, eating it, using it as a topical salve, etc. So we're all struggling through, as you say.
Right, and it goes back to that lack of research, right?
Okay, absolutely.
So we could talk about pesticides all day probably here, but I'm going to go on to challenge number 4. No standard set for medicinal cannabis nationally. This definitely ties into several of your previous statements, but do you see a need for medicinal cannabis standards to be the same or different for recreational cannabis?
So, like I said before, what happens in Oregon is the Oregon Health Authority, who's actually the regulatory body for the medical program, gets to set the testing standards for both the recreational and the medical. And so right now in the state, the testing standards are the same for both products. And something to think about is in a legalized state like Oregon, anybody who's 21 and older can purchase a recreational product. And so that very well could be a medical card holder. There's nothing that would stop them as long as they're of age to go in and purchase a recreational product rather than a medical product. So those medical patients still could be using product from either side of the supply chain. The difference, though, in Oregon is that the concentration limits, so the potency of the products, the medical card holders can purchase a product that has a higher potency than a recreational customer. And that decision was made because they have medical needs that may require them to have more of the potency to actually alleviate their symptoms rather than a recreational customer who would be using it for recreational purposes.
Interesting. Sunny, did you have any comment about that?
Well, I would just say that in Oregon, when Measure 91 passed, another change that occurred is that cannabis is now considered food in Oregon. So prior to Measure 91, it was medicine. It was all regulated under the Oregon Health Authority, and ODA's food safety program did not inspect the facilities. Now that it's no longer considered an adulterant in food under Oregon state law, our food safety program now goes out and does basic sanitation inspections for all of these facilities, again, regardless of whether it's medical or recreational. And that starts from the folks making extracts or concentrates to the folks who are making any of the edible products down to retail stores or dispensaries. So I think that adds another layer of consumer confidence in these products. Amanda mentioned earlier the labeling. Labeling program is working with our food safety staff because labeling traditionally on foods goes through FDA. Again, we run into an issue there. But our staff can provide assistance so that, one, we have labeling that ensures that people know about allergens, right? That could be a medical issue regardless of whether you're a medical cannabis patient or a recreational user. And also, if and when it becomes legal at a federal level, then everybody is already at that national standard as best as possible.
Right, right. That's important. So how does the lack of medicinal standards affect your work?
So I think one of the main ways that it affects our work, probably, and like I work directly for the recreational program, so I don't work with the medical program that much. But I think the standards generally tend to change as the market matures and as the legislature, the agencies, the industry find themselves having different needs, the regulations change. And the regulations, like Sunny was saying, can be very, very different from state to state. And so there's a lot of confusion in the industry about what's required where and why, and then how to be compliant with those rules. And so as far as my particular job goes, and even as at an agency level, you know, it's a balancing act, trying to figure out which regulations to put into place, and then how to effectively educate the industry about those changes to make sure that they can be compliant with the regulations when they come into effect.
And I would just add, we were doing some training last week, and a gentleman walked up, and he works for a recreational store, and he used to work for like a health food store. And, you know, there's a lot of confusion as well as to what kind of recommendations staff that work in these facilities can make to customers as to how to effectively use cannabis, right? They're not medically trained, yet people are looking to them to help them determine what strain do I use if I have anxiety or I'm having trouble sleeping. And so, you know, in Oregon, they would have to be licensed through the OLCC as a marijuana handler permit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have any training on what strain to use for what. And so there's, again, some fuzziness there as to where the regulations are and what these folks can tell the consumer or not.
Okay. I just want to remind our listeners that you can submit questions in the chat box there, and we will be happy to take a look at the questions. And both Amanda and Sunny have agreed to answer questions even if we go over our time here today, which is very nice of them. Okay, challenge number 5, lack of cohesiveness within the industry. Sunny and Amanda, how does the lack of cohesiveness within the industry affect your work?
So probably one of the larger areas with the industry itself that we deal with is if one segment of the industry would like to see a change that's going to benefit their segment. The agency or agencies can't just make that change, even if it seems realistic, without balancing what that change is going to do to the other segments of the industry. Because realistically, by allowing one license type something extra, it could have an ill effect on, let's say, the retailer or the testing laboratory. And so when the agency is making the rules around the law, we really, other than looking at public health and safety and other than looking at the legislation itself, have to really balance how it's going to work within the licensed supply chain, and to make sure that we're not adding an unneeded expense or unneeded stress on another section of the industry.
Sunny, do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it's appropriate here for the next question. A few things come to mind. You know, when I talk to my coworkers about this, I feel like it's important to remind them that we have a really wide spectrum of people in this industry. We have what one might traditionally think of as the Birkenstock tie-dye wearing hippie who's been growing cannabis for 30, 40, 50 years, I don't know. You know, they're enthusiastic about cannabis, but maybe they're not real familiar with running a business. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got folks who come from the banking or insurance industry or engineering, and they get business and they get how to do that. but maybe they look at cannabis as a widget, right? And it's an agricultural crop. It's not a widget. You don't put into and get out for, and it doesn't work that way. And then we have all the people in between. So we've got this really wide spectrum of people with a variety of backgrounds, and then we're growing something that's illegal at a federal level, and yet, you know, we've talked about FDA and we've talked about EPA, and those federal agencies still have a role to play in this industry. You know, we're not even talking about banking here today, but obviously that is an issue. And then on top of that, and I'm sure this is true for other states, we've got a long-standing medical cannabis community who felt like when Measure 91 passed, it said that nothing would be changed in the medical cannabis program, and that just hasn't been the case. They are being brought up to a higher standard, and there's changes that are happening, and so some of them are pretty frustrated and don't feel like they're being respected or treated with a lot of consideration, and so that can cause a lack of cohesiveness as well.
Right, and I do think that you the next question, how do you address the various constituents in the industry with their different needs and requirements? I think you did address that pretty well, and I've been amazed in talking with you guys on all the different constituencies that you are working with across the board. Okay, so what are the most important factors from your perspective that are needed to bring the industry more closely aligned with agreed upon outcomes?
So I kind of wanted to tie in a little bit of the last question about the various constituents, because one of the larger factors here in Oregon outside of the industry would be local jurisdictions and the local opt-in and opt-out, which basically means in the state of Oregon, counties and cities don't have to allow legalized marijuana if they don't wish, or they can have it be voted on again in the future. And so in the state right now, there's really no two cities and counties that have similar marijuana law. And so this adds to the difficulty for the industry. It adds for people that are trying to maybe start up businesses in Oregon who haven't lived here previously, because depending on what area of the state or what city or county that you decide that you want to live in or work in, there may be very, very different requirements to have a marijuana business. And so I think that that's really important to highlight, just because there is a lot of confusion about that. Even though recreational marijuana is legal in the state of Oregon, it's not technically legal to be sold everywhere in the state. And probably one of the biggest factors that will keep the industry more closely aligned and agreed, I think, is, in my opinion, it's going to be time. I think that as the industry matures, as the regulated industry matures, people will be more aligned and be more agreeable for the benefit of the industry rather than the benefit of a segment of the industry. Because I think, and it's my feeling, that everybody really wants this to be a success. They want us to have a really well-regulated, you know, and monetarily beneficial program for the state of Oregon, so that people can receive the tax revenue that they voted on, and that people can receive the legalized product that they know has been tested and met certain standards. And it's just going to take a little bit of time, I think, before people can really get that process streamlined the way that it needs to be successful.
And I would tag on to what Amanda was just saying about time. We've made a lot of changes in a really short amount of time. I don't know that I can point to any other brand spanking new industry that a state agency has had to get up and running, or a state government, really, because there's still changes. Our legislature is meeting right now, and there's lots of topics being discussed. Obviously, people have different feelings about that, and we need time where the legislature isn't making changes to the law. And that isn't to say that the changes they're making aren't necessary. It's brand new. And not only is it a brand new industry, but it's kind of an industry that's been there. And so we're bringing them up to a standard that makes them legitimate. And I think that's what people want, is to be legitimate. Obviously, people are going to have different approaches to getting there. So time where we don't change the laws once we get everything kind of in place. And it's reasonable that it's taken us a couple of years, and there's going to be changes as we move forward. But I think we're all looking forward to an opportunity to just work with a set of laws and get everybody in compliance and moving forward on the same path.
Interesting. Boy, it's really a challenge, isn't it? Since we're talking about collaboration, and it really, one of the great things about working on this webinar with you all is seeing the amount of collaboration that's taking place. Amanda, I see you're going to be going to the Cannabis Compliance Summit in July as a panelist. As a regulator, tell us why you decided to attend.
Well, the OLCC finds collaboration is a very important part of our regulation, and it'll be really valuable to be a panel member and be able to share our experiences from Oregon, but also having the chance to benefit and learn about what other jurisdictions and other states have done. It's always really, really helpful when we look forward in the way that we regulate the program.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, as you guys both said, normally this would be a federal government responsibility, right? but the states are really taking such an active role on their own behalf, and it's really it's a very unique situation in this country, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It is.
All right, we're towards the end of our webinar now, let's get started on some questions. And so we have several questions here, so let me just start asking them. Does Oregon have any issues with lobbyists pushing back in regards to testing? I should have said that Jules asked that question.
Well, that's probably a good question. I would say that, a lobbyist's job generally is to lobby for their organization and, what the beliefs of their members are. So I don't really know, but it probably just depends on what their organization was looking for. We've had people, for the most part, everybody is very, very positive about testing and about the testing requirements, because it really does give the industry a chance to prove that they do have a quality product.
Yeah, I don't think we've had any that were pushing back against testing as a whole. Obviously, there's different pieces that different groups have varying beliefs on or support levels for, but I think, as Amanda said, in general, the support for testing itself has been very positive.
Okay, second question. Jasmine asked, do you think once the final California rules are in place, would they be similar to the ones in Oregon or other recreational states? I think it would be easier if rules and regulations were similar in all recreational states, especially when it comes to testing. Depending on where you sell, you would need to submit different results.
Agreed. One thing to keep in mind is currently you can't sell across state lines. That would be in violation of the federal Cole memo. But at some point that may be a possibility. California's draft rules came out, and I've skimmed them, specifically looking at the pesticide testing, given my background and where I'm working. And they look to be a bit different than Oregon. And as part of that collaboration, we're actually going to be having a phone conference with California so we can understand where they were coming from when they developed those testing rules. But yeah, right now it is quite different among the various states.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to interpret this for the person asking the question. I think what the industry is saying is that they develop products, and once you sort of have your formula, if you have to change that formula, for every other, for different states, it just adds, such a cost burden to the actual manufacturer to not be, even though you can't cross state lines and you manufacture in the state, you want to be, you want to have SOPs and those kinds of things so that you're not, reinventing the wheel in each state, basically.
Sure.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that the testing necessarily requires you to do that. If you're a lab that works across state lines, obviously you would be in that situation, but I think it's just a matter of meeting the testing requirements if you're a manufacturer of a cannabis product.
Right. Okay, next question. Why is it so important for states to have uniform testing standards? What are some problems legal marijuana states face if they don't put standards in place?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, it's very difficult, but my first thought would be that, it's necessary to have some sort of standards just for public health and safety. People are, purchasing this product. A lot of times they're medical patients. I think, at least the way I think about it personally, it benefits society to have certain standards into place and certain thresholds.
Sunny, do you have any comment?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Okay, what advice do you have for new cannabis business owners?
Okay, so I'm going to get to say my favorite thing right now is that all of the, and it kind of ties into the last question too, all of the regulatory bodies are going to have rules, and there's also the general laws. And so anybody who's looking to get into the industry, I think it's really, really important that you get informed on what the rules and the laws are in the place that you're planning on doing business. So like I said earlier, in Oregon, we have jurisdictions that are able to make their own ordinances and rules and laws. And so it would be important to know what those were, as well as the state regulations. It really, I think, makes it easier to do your business planning. And I think it would make it easier to have a successful business because you are being compliant and following the regulations that are in place.
And I would add, it is a business. So just because you're enthusiastic about cannabis doesn't mean you're going to be successful. You need to run it as a real business. And that's going to be figuring out all those laws. You're going to be subject to a bunch of them. And there's a lot of varying authorities that are going to have regulatory authority over you. That's true for any business. That shouldn't be a surprise. And Amanda didn't put the plug in, but I will. Here in Oregon, we have something called the Business Readiness Guidebook that OLCC put together, and all of the various agencies that have a role to play put their part in. So for example, there's a section about ODA and being subject to our ag water quality laws, our food safety program, our pesticide program, OSHA, all of those various agencies at the state level, and it talks to new people about figuring out what their local jurisdiction requirements are before they even get started. And I'm pretty sure Washington has a similar document because I think that's what OLCC used to design ours, and so other states may have that as well.
Okay. Okay, this is a big question. It'll be interesting. How is Oregon protecting itself from the behemoth Canadian investment, which definitely has short-term investments, but in the long run, millions of Oregonian dollars will be leaving the state? Canada is demonstrating even in a regulated environment, their top operators are having pesticide compliance issues. Whoa, that's a big question.
Well, I could speak to the first part of it. We don't have, a lot of states that have a recreational program had some sort of residency requirement to begin with for businesses that were coming in, and Oregon actually does not have that. So if a person or business from another area, another state, another country wanted to come and start a business in Oregon, they could do that. That's fine the way our law is written. I would like to point out, though, that at the end sale to the consumer at the retail level, the product is taxed. So Oregon is receiving tax revenue from the businesses within our state.
Interesting. Okay. Sunny, do you have any comment?
Yeah, I mean, the tail end of that question was talking about testing. Again, it's not going across state lines, so it would be subject to Oregon testing requirements. So if they're growing in Oregon and they fail in Oregon, then they'll be subject to Oregon regulatory enforcement and follow-up.
Right. Okay. What do you hope the cannabis industry achieves? Hold on a second. What do you hope the cannabis industry achieves this year from regulatory testing standards, investment, new tech, advertising? If you were looking at this conversation a year from now, how would you guys define success?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think that probably coming from the regulatory agency that oversees the recreational program, I think I would like to see there to be compliance with the laws and the rules, that the product, is staying in Oregon and in line with all of the state laws. And I'd also like to see, the tax revenue. The cities and the counties are really looking forward to their share of the tax revenue and how it's going to help Oregonians across the board. And so I think that is going to be a really positive outcome of the legalized system.
And I know from ODA's perspective, a really positive outcome would be less pesticide failures. Hopefully that would mean that folks are using pesticides appropriately. Right now we're doing some compliance assistance in hopes and other education and outreach opportunities in hopes of helping the industry become familiar with those pesticide laws and what they can and cannot do. So that would be a very positive outcome in my perspective.
Okay. Okay. Rachel is asking, will the OHA up regulation on testing labs? ORELAP certified is a great attribute, but there should be a testing procedure that OHA regulated for accurate and true testing. Lab shopping is a big thing in this state, so I feel that labs are not checked enough to see if they are compliant.
So as everybody knows, Amanda and I both do not represent OHA or LAP, the body that accredits the testing labs, is starting to do some proficiency testing, as I understand it. Basically, they're sending out samples that have a known amount to the labs and asking them to test and see how close they come to that amount. You would have to follow up with ORLAP to see how that proficiency testing is going, but I do know that they were going to be starting that within the last few months.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out, as we said a couple of times during the presentation, the rules continually get modified. So as there's needs, whether it either be from regulation or needs from the industry, the agencies go back and look at the rules and see how it can be modified to best work. So what you see today as rules and laws, will change over time. And that being said, the Oregon Health Authority does have some modifications to their testing rules that will be coming out in the beginning of June. So we'll see those rules look a little bit different in the very near future.
Okay. Kristen asked, wait, hold on. Kristen asked, in terms of managing passing lab results, are producers using any form of irradiation today?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. All right. Ryan asked, I imagine as we get closer to something federally approved, the industry will need something akin to the U.S. pharmacopoeia with standardized testing for probably two categories, recreational and medicinal. As someone from the pharma industry, I think rather than the FDA going for food standards, it will be closer to nutraceutical or pharma standards. Do you think this is likely?
That's really outside of my background and expertise. I know a lot of people are talking about it. It might be putting the cart before the horse a little bit, because I just don't think we're at that federal level. And boy, howdy, do I not really have a feel for what the feds are talking about.
Okay, right.
And Amanda's shaking her head no, too.
Okay. All right. So I just wanted to give you all the opportunity to kind of do a wrap up here. And is there anything that we didn't talk about here today or a message that you'd like to deliver to the audience that's particularly important to you in your work?
I have enjoyed working with the cannabis industry. You know, I talked about the wide spectrum of people involved in it, and I think that makes it a really interesting, robust group of people, and it brings a lot of joy to my day. Not that it's all about me, but it does make my day more entertaining, and I like getting to work with a wide variety of people. And I think that the take home for me as a regulator is that in general, people want to do the right thing. They may not know what the right thing is, but they're actively seeking that information. And I really enjoy being able to help them figure out what it is that they need to be doing to move forward and make this industry a legitimate, robust industry.
Yeah, and I really have to agree. I have to agree with Sunny on that one. Just being able to have a job where you're working on a public policy like this, it feels very important to me. And then also you have the chance to work on a variety of different issues. You know, when you come in to work in the morning, you may have an idea of what you're going to work on that day, and it could be something completely different, which is exciting to somebody who works as a regulator and works in, you know, building a program from the ground up. There's a lot to be learned, and it's never dull. And we get to really interact, you know, with our other state agencies, with the industry, with citizens, with local jurisdictions. It's very exciting to be part of it, I think.
It's interesting. I just got a question here that's asking about career track. What advice do you have for somebody who might want to get into the regulatory business that you all are in now? What career advice do you have?
It would probably be different. I mean, it's different from state to state. You know, each state, depending on where the regulatory body is within the state, has their own hiring practices. So if it's something that somebody was interested in, I would recommend that they look into, you know, their state job opportunities in an agency where their background, you know, closely meets the regulation that's going on within that agency. And then, you know, try to get as much experience as you can wherever your background may lay, because there is so many different areas where it touches. You know, we're talking as two of the three main agencies with the oversight over the program, but all state agencies almost have a little bit of an area where they're dealing with the legalized industry.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't go to college expecting that I would end up working with the cannabis industry. I went to college and got a degree in topics that interested me and just looked for jobs that met those requirements and kind of ended up here on accident, and I'm, obviously very grateful for that. My mantra is you can't make this stuff up, so you never know. You could have a totally different background and end up working with cannabis, and it would be an appropriate fit.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much to Amanda and Sunny for speaking with us today for the webinar. Thank you for joining our webinar today. To our listeners, as a reminder, you will receive an email with the recording of this webinar within 24 hours. Make sure to sign up for the Cannabis Compliance Summit on July 19th to the 21st in Los Angeles, California. You can register at infocastinc.com/cannabis. And with that, I want to just say a big thank you again to Amanda and Sunny for joining us, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We appreciate your time and wish everyone well. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.